Hello, my name is David Detmer. I'm a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest, and this is part 4 on the topic Exile or Death, the Case of Socrates. And if you've missed any of the first 3 parts, they're available right on this very channel, so it's easy to get caught up. Where I left off last time, I talked about Socrates' trial for corrupting the youth of Athens, where he was convicted and sentenced to death. And he turned down at that time, or he did not suggest exile as a possible alternative, which he would have had the right to do and was commonly done. He rejected that. And I talked about that in the last video and his arguments for that. But the issue of exile comes up again when he is in jail awaiting execution. And this is discussed in another dialogue of Plato's called the Crito, because it's a record of a conversation between Socrates and his friend Crito. So Crito visits Socrates in jail shortly, a day or two before he's scheduled to be executed, and tells him that he has bribed a guard and made arrangements to get Socrates out of jail and to go to another city. And there are other cities, he claims to know that there are other cities that would welcome Socrates and no one would bother him there. And moreover, Crito has personal friends in one of these cities who have pledged they would make sure that Socrates was taken care of very well and would not suffer in his new home. This is the kind of friend I'd like to have if I were facing the death penalty. But Socrates is a philosopher, and so he's interested in the arguments. And he asks Crito, well, what would justify doing that? Because to do that, he going against the state, going against the law. Here it is, he's been convicted of a crime, he's been sentenced to death. And so what Crito is proposing is something where it would be setting aside that judicial verdict. And so Socrates offers, actually there's a scholarly dispute as to whether it's kind of one argument with several components or if it's several distinct arguments. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to bother with that fine point of interpretation, and I'll just talk about the different points he makes. And he makes at least 3 major points in arguing that it would be morally wrong for him to escape from jail and avoid his execution. And one of these, he says that by doing that, he would be harming the state. How can a state continue to exist and not be torn apart if people can just disobey the laws, set aside judicially rendered verdicts as they see fit to do? So wouldn't this be destroying the state? So that's one of his points. Another one of his points is he says, he makes an analogy to parents. He says, you owe everything to your parents. You wouldn't even exist without them. They're the ones who brought you into the world. They're the ones who fed you when you were an infant and all of that kind of thing. And so he says, you owe such a debt of gratitude to your parents that even if when you're an adult, a parent would strike you, you should submit to that and not fight back. You owe them that much gratitude. And so then he argues that the state is that way as well, that we wouldn't be able to live safely and grow to maturity without the protections afforded by the state and the education that the state provides and so forth. So we have this debt of gratitude, which we shouldn't transgress by just setting aside a legally rendered verdict. So that's one of his arguments. And then another one is he says we should not break an agreement provided that that agreement is just. And so he argues that he, Socrates, has entered into a kind of implied contract, a kind of implied agreement to abide by the law and abide by things like the findings of law courts. And what is the basis for that claim? Since obviously, he hasn't officially signed any kind of document or contract or anything like that. And his argument relies on what in more modern times has come to be called the doctrine of tacit consent. So he hasn't explicitly signed a document, but Socrates argues when a person chooses to live in a place and they stay there for years and years and years, when they could easily leave, then by doing that, they are signifying that they find the state acceptable, they find its laws reasonable, and thus they are agreeing to abide by those laws. It's kind of a variation on what's known as social contract theory. And so here it is, he's lived to a ripe old age, he's 70 years old, and he has almost never traveled. He had left Athens during military service, but that's about it. He seemed to love Athens, chose to live there his whole life. And so Plato uses the literary device of having the laws of Athens come to life and speak to Socrates. And they say, haven't you indicated even more than any other Athenian that you approve of us, the laws, you agree with us, the laws. So then you've entered into a kind of contract. We posed no barrier to you leaving and going elsewhere. So it's this kind of tacit consent argument. So unfortunately, in my judgment, at least, this is perhaps the weakest of all of Plato's dialogues, both from a literary and a philosophical standpoint. From a literary standpoint, in many of Plato's dialogues, even though Socrates is shown as sort of the wisest figure, in some of them, the other characters put up a bit of a fight and make Socrates do some work. And you get some interesting arguments and you get some interesting objections to Socrates' claims. Not so in the Crito. Crito himself is a very lame and inept debater. Almost every point that Socrates makes, Crito just says, yes, I agree, Socrates. Yes, it's obvious, Socrates. Yes, who could object to that, Socrates? He doesn't put up anything of a fight. So what could one say if one wanted to put up a bit of a fight and argue with Socrates and say, no, you would be justified in leaving and going elsewhere? So let's take those arguments in turn. So the first one is about how he would be harming the state by leaving. And he even uses a locution, something along the lines of, he has the laws say to him, aren't you trying to overturn the state insofar as you are able by your action? So that insofar as you're able clause seems to be implicitly relying on a universalizability argument. And we're familiar with this from Immanuel Kant, who came years later. The idea that we evaluate an action by thinking about what it would mean for everyone to do that. And if that would result in some kind of contradiction or whatever, it's something we could not will to happen. If everyone did that, that would be a reason not to do it. And so I think it's important that Socrates phrases it that way, because he obviously realizes the action of one person setting aside a legally rendered verdict, that's not going to bring down the state. So he needs that universalizability criterion. If everyone did this, it would bring down the state, it would harm the state. So I think there are a couple of things that can be said in reply to this argument. One is, oftentimes one and the same action will either pass or fail that universalizability test, depending on how it's conceptualized, depending on how much detail you go into. So let me give an example from something else to get at this point. Let's take lying. So it's easy to give a universalizability-based argument against lying. If everyone went around lying, then nobody could trust any information they get from anyone else. So all kinds of bonds of social trust would be destroyed. It would be very cumbersome to try to figure out what the truth is, because you could never count on anybody else to give it to you straight, and so on. It would be a disaster if everybody went around lying all the time. But there are a few cases where one can argue lying is morally the right thing to do. So one example, James Rachels, in his book on the elements of moral philosophy, gives the following example. He cites a Dutch boat captain at the time of World War II who got involved in the practice of smuggling Jews out of Germany to get them away from Hitler and his plan of genocide against the Jews, to protect these Jews from the concentration camps. So it would sometimes happen as he was going through the waters with his Jewish passengers that the German military would stop him and ask him, what are you doing? Who are you? Who do you have on board? If he were to tell the truth and say, well, I've got a bunch of Jews on board that I'm smuggling out of Germany, they would just come on board and seize all of the Jews and probably kill them all in concentration camps. So he lied. And fortunately, the Germans accepted his lie. They didn't go on board and inspect it. And so his scheme of saving these Jews was successful. So if you simply characterize his action as, okay, my policy is I'm going to lie, well, yeah, you can't universalize that. But if you say something like, I'm going to tell the truth, except in situations where I'm lying to mass murderers so as to prevent them from committing murder, it's hard to see how that policy is going to undermine human trust and confidence and so on. So similarly, going back to Socrates, yes, I suppose it's true. If everyone who is found guilty of a crime just finds a way to evade their punishment, then the criminal justice system is going to collapse. That's right. But suppose we characterize it as, what about when someone is being punished for something as innocuous as practicing philosophy? It's hard to see how, if that's our policy, that's going to lead to the state coming down. So the most plausible version of the universalizability principle, I think, would be, all right, if I'm going to do a certain action in a certain situation, would I be willing to accept anyone else in the same situation doing the same thing? So I think Socrates ought to be able to say, yeah, any philosopher whom they're going to put to death for practicing philosophy, I'd be happy for them escaping that fate. One other way of making this point is this thing about, what you're doing. Isn't it that you're sort of trying for everyone to do it? That's the whole point about where the laws say, what do you think you're doing trying to escape, Socrates? Aren't you trying to bring down the state insofar as you are able? Sort of implying, yeah, you can't do it by yourself, but if everybody else followed your example. Well, suppose someone takes a job carrying the mail. Well, look, it would be a disaster if everyone did that. There'd be no farmers, there'd be no scientists, there'd be no doctors, there'd be no teachers. But obviously, that's a ridiculous argument against taking a job carrying the mail. So those are a few things that an intelligent interlocutor might have said to Socrates, and Crito fails to do so. Similarly, with this point about the obligations to parents, out of gratitude, we all might agree that we owe a debt of gratitude to our parents, and there might be lots of sacrifices that the parents would be within their rights to ask of us in return for the sacrifices we made for them. But I'm not sure it follows we have to go so far as to take physical abuse from them, as Socrates says. If your parent wants to come and hit you without justification, I'm not sure that we would want to say that's something you have to submit to. And similarly, even if you accept Socrates' claim that he owes a huge debt of gratitude to the state, does that debt extend so far as to mean you have to die for them without just cause? To die for the state simply because you asked a lot of awkward philosophical questions. But then the one that is the most pertinent to this point about exile is the doctrine of tacit consent seems to assume that it is easy to leave one's own country and go to another. Because if you think about the doctrine of tacit consent, yes, suppose I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, So suppose we've got an exam scheduled for a certain day, and I ask the students, does anyone object if we change it and have it 2 days later? And anyone who has a problem with that, please raise your hand. Well, there, if they don't raise their hand, I could reasonably say they're tacitly consenting to the change in schedule, because it's not hard to raise your hand. But if I were to say, anyone who doesn't want to change the date, please so indicate by poking your eye out with a pencil. Well, the fact that they don't poke their eye out with a pencil doesn't really prove that they're consenting. It means it's too costly to consent. You have to poke your eye out. So similarly, for many people, going into exile imposes a huge cost. They would be going to a place where perhaps they don't know the language. They don't know sort of the manners and the unstated social rules. They maybe don't have a job there. They don't have any friends there. They don't have any family there. They're leaving behind the family and friends that they do have. It's a big deal. So it's one thing if people voluntarily do that. And of course, we know many, many people do, because the life they have in their current country is very bad, and they see a better life elsewhere. But the idea that simply by having lived in a place for a long time without leaving, that shows that you're agreeing with all of the laws, that seems implausible, because that implies that if you find the laws wrong, you're morally obliged to leave. That's sort of the only way you can avoid complying with them. So think of what that would mean. That would mean during the Jim Crow era in the United States, African Americans who didn't like those racist laws, they have to leave the country. And if they don't, they're consenting to those laws. That's obviously, Crito couldn't have used that example, but it seems like to me that's the kind of point that Crito should have made. One other point that goes specifically to the philosophy of Socrates is in his conversation with Crito, he several times makes the point that, I should back up to explain something. When Crito is arguing that Socrates should leave, he talks a lot about sort of worldly success, about how if you allow yourselves to be executed, your enemies will win and you will lose, and you will get a bad reputation, and your friends will get a bad reputation. And people would think that we, your friends, were not willing to spend the money to bribe the guards to get you out. So we'll be thought of as cheapskates, and we'll get a bad reputation. So we'll all be harmed in this way. And then Socrates responds by saying, look, those aren't really serious harms. Things like reputation and so on, who cares? A wise person shouldn't care about that. Real harm is when you diminish someone in terms of something excellent, like their justice. If you corrupt a person and make them less just, now you've really harmed them. So with that in mind, it's interesting that he's so ready to let the state of Athens kill him, because that makes the state of Athens less just. So here he is expressing, I don't want to harm the state of Athens because I owe it such loyalty. And yet he's willing to let the state of Athens harm him in this way. So I think that's the conclusion I want to draw about Socrates. A couple of general points about the issue of exile. And I'll sort of make two. I want to underscore the point I was making, that for someone to be exiled involuntarily is to impose on them a very large hardship that people underestimate for the reasons I was mentioning before. On the other hand, given the hardships involved in uprooting oneself from one culture and going to another, a person's desire to do that would tend to indicate that things are very bad for them where they are. That's not true in every case, but oftentimes it is. So that's one of many reasons why I think it is best for countries to have a liberal immigration policy, not a heavily restrictive one. And on that note, I'm going to stop. I just want to thank everyone for watching this series of videos. Again, if you missed the first 3 installments, you can find these on this same channel. Thank you so much for your attention. Take care.